What if humans evolved to live twice as long? Imagine waking on the morning of your 82nd birthday and realizing that almost nobody considers you old. Your hair may have silvered slightly at the temples. Your face carries lines that were not there at 40. But your hands are steady. Your bones are strong. Your heart still responds to exercise the way a healthy 40-year-old heart responds in our world. You have been working for nearly 60 years, but today you are not retiring. You are beginning medical school. Your mother is 129. She lives 3 streets away and still walks to the market most mornings. Your son is 43 and is only now deciding whether the career he chose at 26 is really the work he wants to do for the next century. Your family is not unusual. The newspaper carries no story about your birthday. There is no local television crew waiting outside. 82 is simply middle age. In this world, a healthy human life commonly lasts 150 or 160 years. Some people reach 180. A very rare few go beyond that. And most important, those extra decades are not merely years of prolonged frailty. Human bodies themselves have evolved to age more slowly. Tonight, let us imagine what that would really mean. Not only for wrinkles and birthdays, but for childhood, love, ambition, wealth, politics, memory, family, science, war, retirement, grief, and the strange way a human mind decides how much of its life is still ahead. Because doubling the human lifespan would not simply make the same life longer. It would change the shape of life itself. And before we wander into that longer world, there is one important scientific point to make. Aging is not a single clock hidden somewhere inside the body. There is no one biological spring that simply winds down until it stops. Aging is more like a vast city slowly becoming harder to maintain. DNA accumulates damage. The systems that repair it become less perfect. Proteins are made, folded, recycled, and sometimes damaged, and the machinery responsible for keeping them in order gradually becomes less efficient. Mitochondria, the structures that help cells manage energy, change with age. Stem cell pools become less capable of renewing tissues. Some damaged cells enter a state called senescence and remain alive while altering the chemistry around them. Communication between tissues changes. Chronic inflammation becomes more common. The microbiome changes. Epigenetic patterns, the chemical instructions that help cells decide which genes to use, drift over time. Modern researchers often organize these processes into interconnected hallmarks of aging. They are not 12 independent clocks. They influence one another. Damage in one system can create pressure in another. A body that remained healthy for twice as long would therefore need more than unusually long telomeres or one extraordinary longevity gene. It would need a different maintenance strategy. And nature has already shown that very different mammalian lifespans are biologically possible. A mouse may live only a few years. Humans live far longer. Bowhead whales can exceed 2 centuries. Even though they possess vastly more cells than we do and have had far more time for those cells to go wrong. Recent work on bowhead whales has found unusually efficient and accurate DNA repair processes. One clue to how a mammal can remain alive for so long without simply accumulating cancer at an impossible rate. So our hypothetical does not require biology to perform something completely outside the range of nature. It requires evolution to have taken the human body farther along a path that other species have already explored in their own ways. Perhaps our cells would repair DNA more faithfully. Perhaps damaged proteins would be cleared more efficiently. Perhaps inflammatory responses would switch off more cleanly after they had done their work. Perhaps stem cells would preserve their regenerative capacity longer. Perhaps cancers would encounter more layers of resistance before they could become dangerous. Perhaps several of these changes would evolve together. The result would not be immortality. At 150, people would still age. They would still become vulnerable. Eventually, organs would lose reserve. cancers would become more likely, infections harder to survive, healing slower. Death would remain part of life. The curve would simply move. A 75-year-old body in this world might function roughly the way a 40-year-old body does in ours. A 120-year-old might feel something like a modern 65-year-old. Only much later would the steep decline of very old age begin. That distinction matters, because merely doubling the years of frailty would create a very different and much less attractive world. What we are imagining tonight is doubled health span as well as lifespan. The underlying pace of biological aging has slowed. But that raises a deeper question. Why would evolution ever do this? Natural selection does not care about long life simply because long life is pleasant. It favors traits that help genes continue into future generations. And one of the central insights of evolutionary theories of aging is that the force of natural selection generally weakens later in adulthood. If a harmful genetic effect appears only after most reproduction has already happened, selection has less power to remove it. A gene that improves survival or reproduction when young may even be favored despite causing damage much later. For humans to evolve a lifespan of 160 years, old age would therefore have to matter more to evolutionary success than it did in our own history. And perhaps, in this alternate human story, it does. Imagine early humans becoming even more dependent on accumulated knowledge than our ancestors already were. Food sources become harder to locate. Seasonal migration routes become more complicated. Medicinal plants require decades of experience to recognize correctly. Toolmaking becomes increasingly specialized. Children remain dependent for a long time, and families containing strong, knowledgeable older adults consistently raise more surviving children than families that lose those adults early. An elder of 70 is not merely someone who has survived. She knows where water remained during the drought 40 years earlier. He remembers which valley flooded after an unusual winter. She can identify a fever that appeared once in her youth and explain which treatment helped. He has negotiated with neighboring groups for decades and knows which promises are likely to hold. In our own evolutionary history, researchers have long debated ideas such as the grandmother hypothesis, which proposes that older adults can increase their evolutionary success by helping descendants survive and reproduce. Humans already stand out among primates for our long lives and unusual post-reproductive years. Now imagine that effect becoming stronger. Generation after generation, individuals who remain healthy into their 70s and 80s leave more surviving descendants, not only because they may reproduce later, but because their knowledge, provisioning, protection, and care improve the success of children and grandchildren. As human societies become more cooperative and external causes of death fall somewhat, living long enough for late life maintenance to matter becomes more common. Selection no longer fades quite as quickly after early adulthood. Slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, the human life history shifts. But there is a price. Long-lived species usually cannot simply add decades while leaving everything else unchanged. Biology is built from trade-offs. Energy spent on rapid growth and intense early reproduction is energy not spent on long-term maintenance. A species that invests more heavily in preserving its body may mature more slowly and reproduce more cautiously. So children in our alternate world probably do not become adults at exactly the same age as children in ours. A baby still learns to walk in roughly familiar ways. A 6-year-old still plays. A teenager still experiences the awkward revolution of becoming a separate person. But physical maturation is slightly slower. Brain development remains plastic for longer, and the social boundary of adulthood shifts. At 18, someone may be legally capable of many things, yet culturally still considered very young. Higher education commonly continues into the late 20s. First marriages in many societies occur in the 30s or 40s. Parenthood often begins later. Fertility itself has evolved to decline more slowly, although it has not become unlimited. A 40-year-old new parent is ordinary. A 50-year-old first-time parent barely attracts notice. This alone begins changing history. Because if people live twice as long but also wait longer between generations, the population does not automatically explode in the simple way we might first imagine. That is one of the easiest mistakes to make with this hypothetical. If everyone suddenly became immortal tomorrow while birth rates remained exactly the same, population growth would indeed become extraordinary. But an evolved, long-lived species would almost certainly have a different reproductive schedule. Longer lives, later maturity, lower mortality, and slower generational turnover would influence one another. Families might have fewer children spread across a longer period. Generations might be separated by 40 or 50 years instead of 25 or 30. 4 living generations could still be common. 5 might occur. 6 would be remarkable rather than inevitable. The world would not simply contain twice as many people. It would contain people who move through time differently. And perhaps the first place we would notice this most clearly would be school. In our world, education is heavily front-loaded. We spend childhood and early adulthood learning, then several decades working, and eventually we retire. In a 160-year life, that pattern becomes almost absurd. Imagine choosing a profession at 23 and being expected to remain in it for 100 years. Very few people would want to. So education becomes cyclical. At 25, you may train as an engineer. At 58, after 3 decades designing bridges, you return to university for 5 years and become a historian. At 94, you study ecology. At 120, you stop working for a decade, travel, care for family, and then teach part-time until 140. The question children hear is no longer, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" It becomes, "What would you like to do first?" That small change in wording would reveal an enormous change in psychology, because choices would feel less final. A wrong career at 25 would not consume most of your adult life. A failed business at 30 might become a story you tell at 90, before beginning something entirely different. A relationship ending at 40 would still hurt, but it would not necessarily feel like the closing of your last great chapter. There would always seem to be more horizon, at least while you were young, and that may be one of the strangest consequences of all. In our world, time changes its emotional weight as we age, partly because the amount remaining becomes visibly smaller. At 20, 1 year feels like a large experience, but a small fraction of the future. At 70, the future feels more finite. In this longer-lived world, that shift would arrive much later. A person of 60 might still feel unmistakably early in adult life. An 80-year-old could reasonably begin a project expected to take 25 years. A 90-year-old might say, without irony, "I can always do that later." And humanity would discover that having more time does not necessarily make us better at using it. More time, after all, also means more opportunities to postpone. Consider the 82-year-old whose birthday we imagined at the beginning. Let us give her a name. Mara. For most of her life, Mara has been an architect. She began training at 27, spent 10 years learning and apprenticing, and by 40 was designing public buildings. At 56, she helped rebuild a coastal city after a major storm. At 68, she became the head of a large firm. At 79, she resigned. Not because she had become frail, because she had become bored. For several years, she had carried a private fascination with medicine. In our world, an 80-year-old deciding to spend a decade training as a physician would be extraordinary, partly because of the physical demands and partly because there may not be enough working years left for the investment to make sense. In Mara's world, the calculation is different. If she finishes at 92, she may still have 40 or 50 healthy professional years ahead. So on her 82nd birthday, Her family gives her a new stethoscope. Her mother laughs and says, "You always did take a long time to decide." Her son asks whether anatomy will be difficult. And Mara says that compared with building regulations, the human body cannot possibly be worse. This kind of reinvention would become normal. Companies would have to change with it. The idea of a 40-year career followed by retirement would disappear. Employers would expect sabbaticals lasting several years, complete retraining, and repeated periods of leaving and returning. Professional licenses might require renewal through new education, not only because knowledge changes, but because a person may practice for a century. Universities would change from institutions mainly serving the young into places where 25-year-olds sit beside 80-year-olds and 120-year-olds. A lecturer might look across a classroom and find a student older than the lecturer's grandparents. That sounds charming. Sometimes it would be. But longevity would create a difficult problem at the top of every profession. People would stay. A brilliant surgeon could occupy a prestigious position for 70 years. A celebrated professor might control a department for half a century. A judge appointed at 50 could still be serving at 120. A founder could dominate a company long after several generations of younger workers had arrived beneath her. Experience would accumulate enormously. So would power. And societies would learn very quickly that longer, healthy lives require stronger rules for circulation. Mandatory retirement might still exist, not because an older person is incapable, but because no institution can renew itself if nobody ever leaves. Leadership terms become more important. Universities rotate chairs. Courts impose service limits. Corporations restrict how long one person can remain chief executive. Political constitutions become unusually suspicious of lifetime appointments. In a species that lives 160 years, a ruler who captures power at 40 could theoretically remain in control for a century. Human history would contain dynasties of individuals, not merely families. Imagine a king crowned at 38 who is still alive when the grandchildren of the people who watched his coronation become grandparents themselves. Imagine a revolutionary leader who remains the symbolic center of a nation for 90 years. Imagine a dictator with modern surveillance technology and a biologically healthy century in which to consolidate authority. Longevity would not automatically make politics wiser. It could make political memory deeper, but it could also make entrenched power astonishingly durable. This would shape democracy from its earliest forms. Term limits that feel optional in our world might become essential in this one. Some offices could ban immediate re-election for decades. Upper chambers might reserve seats for age groups rather than regions. Political parties could require leadership turnover because otherwise the same figures might dominate public life from one historical era into another. A politician could personally remember events from 100 years earlier. That sounds useful, and it would be. But memory does not guarantee wisdom. Someone who survived a war at 30 might spend the next century determined never to repeat it. Another person might spend that same century nursing the grievance that caused it. Long memory can preserve lessons. It can also preserve hatred. In our own world, historians sometimes speak about generations replacing one another as a force of cultural change. People raised under different assumptions enter institutions, challenge old habits, and gradually transform what seems normal. In a world where generations turn over much more slowly, that process changes. Ideas could remain socially dominant for longer because the people who built institutions around them remain present and influential. Scientific progress might feel this tension especially strongly. At first, the effect seems entirely positive. Imagine a mathematician beginning serious work at 30 and remaining cognitively healthy until 130. She could pursue one problem for 70 years. An astronomer could personally supervise observations across a century. An ecologist could begin measuring a forest as a young researcher, and still be there when the trees reach maturity. A physician could follow the same families across 5 generations. Longitudinal science would become almost unimaginably powerful. Researchers would not always inherit data sets from people who died before conclusions became possible. The same mind that designed an experiment might still be present when the final result arrives 60 years later. Engineering projects could become equally ambitious. A person who begins designing a new city at 40 might live long enough to see how the neighborhoods function at 120. Architects could see whether their buildings really lasted. Policymakers could no longer assume that the consequences of decisions 70 years away belonged to some distant generation. They might personally live in them. Climate policy would feel different when a minister approving infrastructure in 2080 expects to be alive in 2160. So would nuclear waste planning, forest management, pension design, public debt, and every other problem whose consequences unfold slowly. Longer lives could lengthen political time horizons. But science has another side. Old theories can survive because their defenders survive. A researcher who built a career around one explanation might remain influential for 80 years. A prestigious school of thought could occupy laboratories, funding committees, and journals for far longer than it does now. Younger scientists might wait decades for positions controlled by older scholars who are still competent and productive. So this world develops formal mechanisms for intellectual turnover too. Research grants may limit how many consecutive decades the same person can lead a field-wide program. Universities may reserve laboratories for investigators under 60. Scientific academies may rotate voting rights. Not because older minds are assumed to be inferior, but because a healthy intellectual ecosystem needs both accumulated experience and genuinely new perspectives. That tension would appear everywhere. Wisdom versus renewal, memory versus flexibility, patience versus delay, and perhaps nowhere would it become more personal than inside a family. Mara's mother, Elian, is 129. When Mara begins medical school, Elian is delighted. She has seen her daughter change careers before, although never this dramatically. She remembers Mara at 12, drawing imaginary houses on the backs of grocery receipts. She remembers the first apartment Mara rented. She remembers the storm that nearly destroyed the coastal district Mara later redesigned. For Mara, those events belong to separate eras of life. For Elian, they are still part of one continuous relationship with her child. That is one gift of extreme longevity that would be difficult to measure economically. More time together. Parents could know their adult children for a century. Siblings might share 140 years of memories. Childhood friendships could plausibly continue for longer than entire countries have existed in our world. Family stories would stop feeling distant so quickly. A person could hear about a historical event directly from a great-grandparent who experienced it 70 or 80 years before the listener was born. Oral history would stretch farther. A 150-year-old at a family dinner might remember a neighborhood, technology, or political movement that younger relatives know only from archives. Yet here again, the simple version of the story is misleading. Longer life would not necessarily mean 6 or 7 generations constantly sitting around the same table. If people reproduce later, generations become more widely spaced. Elian had Mara at 47. Mara had her son at 39. Her son, at 43, has no children yet and does not feel late. The family contains fewer generational layers than a first glance at their ages might suggest. But the relationships inside each layer last much longer. That changes parenting. In our world, parents often spend 2 or 3 decades actively raising children before those children become fully independent. In this alternate world, childhood and education extend somewhat, but parents themselves are also healthier for much longer. Grandparents can be deeply involved without being fragile. Great-grandparents may still be working, traveling, and providing care. A child might grow up with four older adults who each expect to remain active parts of the family for most of that child's own adult life. This could make families remarkably resilient. It could also make them remarkably complicated. Imagine being 80 and still receiving unsolicited career advice from your 130-year-old mother. Imagine being 110 and having a living parent who still remembers every foolish decision you made at 25. Some arguments might last a very long time. So might expectations. A family business founded by a grandparent could still be controlled by that grandparent when the grandchildren themselves reach middle age. Inheritance could be delayed until heirs are already old by our standards. Property could remain in the same hands for a century. This would force legal systems to rethink wealth, because money behaves strangely when humans live twice as long. Compound growth over a century can be enormous. Someone who owns valuable land at 40 and keeps it until 150 has far more time to accumulate assets than a person in our world. If ownership simply passes only at death, younger adults may wait until 90 or 100 before receiving inheritances that, in our world, often arrive much earlier. The wealth gap between people who inherit early and people who do not could become immense. A successful investor might have a century for returns to compound. A landlord might collect rent from several generations of the same tenant family. A corporation controlled by one individual could become a personal empire spanning 100 years. So societies would probably develop stronger mechanisms for transferring resources during life. Inheritance might occur in stages. Parents could be expected to distribute portions of family wealth at children's 40th, 70th, and 100th birthdays. Property taxes might increase with uninterrupted decades of ownership. Trusts could automatically release assets across generations rather than waiting for death. The phrase old money would take on a more literal meaning, and retirement would become almost unrecognizable. Mara's grandfather, before he died at 157, retired 3 times. The first time was at 74, when he left a shipping company and spent 6 years sailing. Then he trained as a teacher. He retired again at 108, cared for his partner through an illness, and later began consulting for a transportation cooperative. At 134, he stopped paid work almost entirely. This pattern is common. Instead of one long career followed by one long retirement, people alternate work, study, caregiving, travel, and rest across a century of adult life. Pension systems therefore become less about supporting 30 final years after work and more about financing repeated breaks throughout life. Workers may accumulate time credits. 10 years of employment could earn 1 year of publicly supported leave. Retirement accounts might be accessible in carefully limited intervals at 60, 90, and 120. Employers plan around people disappearing for 3 years and returning with a new qualification. The result could be a society that treats time itself more flexibly, or it could become a society that expects people to work forever. That possibility would be impossible to ignore. If the body remains capable for 130 years, governments under financial pressure may continually raise the age at which full support begins. You are only 90, officials might say. You have decades left. Longevity could become a gift that institutions quietly convert into obligation. A person might receive 80 extra healthy years and discover that society has claimed 60 of them for additional labor. So one of the great political arguments of this world would not simply be how long humans should work. It would be who owns the extra time. That argument would reach into love as well. Marriage vows evolved in cultures where a lifetime, though emotionally enormous, was biologically much shorter than the one we are imagining. In Mara's world, 2 people marrying at 35 might reasonably face 120 years together. Some couples would cherish that possibility. Others would find it daunting. Law and custom would adapt in many different ways. Some cultures might preserve lifelong marriage and celebrate centennial anniversaries, as one of society's great milestones. Others might normalize renewable marriage contracts lasting 20 or 30 years, not because love has become less serious, but because asking two people to predict a century of personal change may feel unrealistic. There would be people who choose one partner for life. There would be people who build several profound partnerships across different chapters. There would be widows and widowers who remarry at 120 and still expect decades together. The phrase late life romance would have to move, and the emotional experience of identity would become more complicated than our language currently allows. Think about your own earliest memories. Even within an ordinary lifespan, the person you were 20 or 30 years ago can feel both intimately familiar and strangely distant. You know that child was you. You remember some of what that person wanted and feared. Yet your values, habits, relationships, and even the physical matter of your body have changed enormously. Now extend that distance across 140 years of conscious memory. A long-lived person at 130 may remember being 20. But how? Not as a continuous recording. Human memory is reconstructive. Details fade. Stories replace raw experience. Photographs and recordings reinforce some moments while others disappear. Over a very long life, a person's autobiography might become a chain of partially remembered selves. Society would develop tools to help. Personal archives become common. Families store recordings, letters, medical histories, and annotated photographs across more than a century. Some people maintain journals not for posterity, but simply so that their future selves can remember who they once were. At 88, Mara opens a diary she wrote at 26 and is startled by the certainty of the young woman on the page. She had believed architecture would be the only work she would ever love. She had believed she would never leave the city where she was born. She had believed a relationship that ended at 31 would define the rest of her life. Mara smiles. Then she feels a small tenderness for that younger self, because the woman who wrote those words could not imagine how much life remained. This might be one of the psychological gifts of longer lives. People would have repeated evidence that identities can change. Failure might feel less permanent, but regret could also grow. More years create more decisions, more paths not taken, more relationships lost, more chances to ask whether an entirely different life would have been possible. A person of 140 might carry memories of 4 careers, 3 homes, 2 marriages, old political causes, dead friends, abandoned ambitions, and versions of herself whose choices she no longer understands. Therapy would change accordingly. Psychologists might specialize not simply in childhood or midlife, but in transitions between long adult chapters. There could be a recognized crisis around 70, when people realize their first major identity has run its course, but half a lifetime remains. Another might occur at 120, when biological aging finally becomes difficult to ignore. The old idea of a midlife crisis would become almost comically imprecise. Which middle? People might have several. And then there is grief. At first, longevity seems as if it should reduce grief because loved ones remain with us longer. Often it would. A child might have a healthy parent present for nearly a century. Friendships could last longer than most human institutions. Couples could share decades unavailable to us. But longer life does not eliminate loss. It postpones some losses and multiplies the years in which others can occur. Accidents still happen. Disease still exists. War still kills. Some people die young relative to the new norm. And what counts as young changes. A death at 70 in Mara's world may feel the way a death in the 30s or 40s feels in ours. Not merely sad, but violently premature. The phrase "she had so much life ahead of her" carries a different scale. A 70-year-old may have expected another 90 years. That could make accidental death emotionally even harder to understand. Insurance systems would price risks differently. Safety cultures might become stricter because the potential future lost in a preventable death is larger. Dangerous occupations could become socially harder to justify. Vehicles, workplaces, sports, and public infrastructure might be designed around a civilization unusually unwilling to accept early mortality. Perhaps people themselves become more cautious. Or perhaps not. A person who expects 160 years might take more risks at 30 because life seems almost endless. Teenagers in our world already know they are mortal and often behave as if they are not. Doubling lifespan may not change that ancient feature of youth. Still, risk would acquire strange mathematics. Suppose a dangerous hobby carries a tiny annual chance of death. Over 120 years of participation, repeated exposure accumulates. Long-lived people might become very conscious of risks that seem negligible over a short horizon. Radiation exposure, occupational toxins, chronic sleep deprivation, repetitive injury, and environmental pollutants would all be evaluated over a much longer lifetime. Medicine would have to think in these terms too. A drug that creates a small cancer risk 30 years later might be acceptable to an 80-year-old in our world if it treats a serious condition now. In Mara's world, an 80-year-old may still expect another 80 years. Long-term side effects matter more. Medical trials might need extraordinary follow-up periods. A treatment approved after 10 years could still reveal problems half a century later. Fortunately, long-lived researchers and stable health records would make those extended studies easier to maintain. But healthcare itself would be very different because the diseases of aging would be shifted rather than erased. Heart disease, dementia, stroke, osteoporosis, cancer, and immune decline would still exist, but many would appear much later. A 100-year-old could have the medical profile of someone in their 50s or 60s today. Hospitals would see far fewer frail 80-year-olds and many more active patients over 100. The word geriatric might apply mainly after 130. Yet cancer presents a special evolutionary challenge. The longer a multicellular organism lives, the more time its cells have to accumulate mutations. A human species routinely reaching 160 could not simply preserve all our present cancer defenses unchanged. Evolution would have needed to improve them. Perhaps DNA damage is repaired with greater fidelity. Perhaps cells with dangerous alterations are detected more efficiently. Perhaps tissue environments are less hospitable to malignant growth. Long-lived mammals show that evolution can solve this problem through different combinations of mechanisms. The bowhead whale is an especially beautiful reminder of that. Some individuals appear to live more than 200 years. Recent evidence suggests their cells can repair certain forms of DNA damage with unusually high accuracy. They are not magical. They are mammals whose evolutionary history produced a maintenance system very different from that of a mouse. Our alternate humans would need something similar in principle, though not necessarily the same molecules. Their bodies would be expensive to maintain. They might heal more carefully rather than more quickly. Cell division could be more tightly controlled. Metabolism might run slightly differently. Immune responses could be less prone to chronic inflammation. The balance between regeneration and cancer suppression might be tuned in a way our bodies never evolved. Those biological differences could have subtle, everyday consequences. Children might grow somewhat more slowly. Wounds might close at a familiar speed but remodel for longer. Muscle could remain responsive to training into much later ages. Fertility might begin later and decline later. Menopause, if it still exists, could occur much later than it does for us. Or the post-reproductive phase could remain long if older adults continue contributing strongly to descendants. There is no single inevitable solution. Evolution rarely writes neat designs. It modifies whatever already exists. And that means a twice-lived human would probably not feel like a perfectly engineered person. They would still have bad backs. They would still need sleep. They would still catch colds, break bones, develop allergies, and complain about digestion. They would simply be built to preserve function for far longer before the broad systems of aging begin failing together. That creates an interesting problem for medicine. Would people in such a world still become obsessed with extending life even further? Almost certainly. A species that considers 160 normal would not necessarily regard 160 as enough. The same laboratories that study aging in our world would study why some alternate humans reach 180 while others die at 140. They would examine genetic variants, immune patterns, metabolism, and cellular repair. Companies would market supplements promising 200 years. Influencers would announce proven rejuvenation routines. Governments would regulate clinics selling treatments that may or may not work. The target would move. At one point in human history, surviving childhood was the great challenge. Later, reaching 70 became common in many societies. In this world, people would ask why 160 should be the limit. Longevity does not abolish the desire for more time. It may strengthen it. And that brings us to another uncomfortable question. Who gets the full lifespan? Evolution may give the species the biological capacity to live 160 years, but social conditions decide how much of that capacity individuals actually reach. In our world, life expectancy varies dramatically with poverty, violence, access to healthcare, nutrition, pollution, working conditions, and geography. A long-lived species would not automatically eliminate those inequalities. They might become more morally visible. Imagine two children born with essentially the same biological potential. One grows up with clean air, safe housing, preventive medicine, and stable nutrition and can reasonably expect 160 healthy years. The other lives amid conflict, dangerous labor, untreated infection, and pollution and often dies before 90. A 70-year gap in expected life would be staggering. Longevity policy would therefore become one of the largest questions of justice. Public sanitation, vaccines, maternal care, workplace safety, and environmental regulation would not merely add a few years. They could determine whether someone receives half of the lifespan their body was built to have. The politics of health would become the politics of time, and time might become the most unequal resource of all. Once a society begins thinking of time as distributable wealth, almost every institution changes. Consider housing. In our world, homes often pass between owners on the timescale of decades. In Mara's world, a healthy adult could occupy the same apartment for 100 years. Neighborhood turnover slows. Family houses remain occupied by their original buyers long after the architects who designed them would have died in our timeline. Cities respond by building for long horizons. A 30-year mortgage seems strangely short when adulthood itself can last more than a century. Loans might run 60 years, but banks would also know that borrowers can remain employed much longer. Buildings are designed for adaptation across generations of technology because the same occupants may live through those changes personally. Mara, trained as an architect, remembers this from her first career. At 49, she designed a residential complex required by law to include what planners called century flexibility, walls that could be moved without disturbing structural systems, service shafts large enough for technologies not yet invented, accessibility features that could be added as residents aged, and communal rooms that could change from childcare spaces to laboratories to clinics over the building's life. The clients complained about the cost. 70 years later, Mara walks past the complex and sees that it is still functioning. Some of the original residents are still there too. That experience becomes normal in a long-lived civilization. People live long enough to discover whether the things they built were actually good. Promises become harder to make casually. A politician who approves a dam expected to last 100 years may still be alive when cracks appear. An executive who orders toxic waste buried for 80 years may eventually live near the consequences. A developer who removes a forest cannot assume that restoration belongs to descendants she will never meet. This could produce a profound increase in long-term responsibility, or it could simply produce better lawyers. Human nature does not become noble merely because calendars become longer. People can discount a future they personally expect to inhabit just as they can ignore a doctor's warning about their own health. Yet the psychological distance would shrink. Climate change offers a particularly interesting example. In our world, one of its political difficulties is that some of the largest consequences unfold over decades, beyond the careers of current leaders and sometimes beyond their expected lives. In Mara's world, a 40-year-old legislator discussing sea level rise in 80 years is discussing the coast where she may spend her own old age. A company chief choosing whether to reduce emissions might expect to be alive when the climate models she dismisses are tested by reality. Young adults could watch century-scale restoration projects reach completion. Foresters might plant trees they expect to walk beneath at maturity. This does not guarantee better environmental behavior. Longer lives also mean more decades of consumption. One person may own cars, eat food, heat homes, fly, purchase goods, and use energy for twice as long. If birth rates and consumption remain high, resource pressure could increase sharply. The environmental question becomes not simply how many people exist, but how much material throughput each long life requires. Durability becomes culturally important. Why buy furniture intended to survive 5 years if you may own it for 80? Products designed to be repaired could become more attractive. A watch might pass through the same person's hands for a century. Clothing companies might maintain garments across decades. Houses would be renovated rather than demolished. Tools and appliances could have standardized parts intended for generations of repair. Or consumer culture could move in the opposite direction, with one person consuming through twice as many cycles of fashion and technology. The biology gives society more time. It does not tell society what to do with it. Law would face similarly strange questions. What is a life sentence when a person may live 160 years? If someone commits murder at 30 and receives imprisonment for life, the punishment could exceed a century. Would that be considered justice, cruelty, or both? Some legal systems might replace open-ended life sentences with maximum terms measured as fractions of expected adult lifespan. Others might argue that taking a victim's potential century of future life makes severe punishment even more appropriate. Criminal rehabilitation would become more consequential. A person convicted at 25 might complete a 20-year sentence at 45 and still have more than 100 years in which to live differently. Societies would have a powerful practical reason not to define someone forever by an early crime. Expungement laws could become more generous. Records might fade after several decades. The right to be forgotten would become more than a digital privacy idea. It would be necessary for allowing a person to have multiple adult lives. Imagine being denied work at 110 because of a foolish offense committed at 23. A civilization built for longevity would eventually have to decide how long consequences should follow a person. Contracts would confront the same problem. A non-compete agreement lasting 20 years could consume only a small part of a career, yet still be considered excessive. Copyright might become controversial if an author lives 150 years and then protection continues after death. Patents lasting 20 years might feel brief compared with an inventor's working life. Debts could theoretically remain collectible for generations of personal adulthood. Law would need expiration dates for almost everything, not because memory is unimportant, because without expiration, the past could suffocate the future. This is perhaps the central cultural challenge of a species that remembers for so long. How do you preserve experience without becoming trapped inside it? History itself would feel different when witnesses remained alive. In our world, A major event slowly passes from living memory into recorded history as its final witnesses die. The transition can happen within a century. In Mara's world, living memory stretches almost twice as far. A war fought 100 years ago may still have millions of veterans and civilians alive who remember it directly. A political revolution may still be argued about by people who stood in the streets during it. Survivors of persecution could address students born a century after the event and speak not from inherited family stories, but from personal experience. This would make history extraordinarily vivid. It could also make reconciliation harder. Consider two neighboring countries that fought a brutal war 80 years earlier. In our world, by that point most soldiers would be gone. In this world, many are still middle-aged or early old age. The people negotiating a new trade agreement may include those who personally lost homes, siblings, or friends in the conflict. They remember exactly what happened. That could make them determined to protect peace, or unwilling to forgive. Some peace treaties might include formal generational mechanisms precisely because the generation that fought the war will remain politically powerful for another half-century. Truth commissions could operate for decades. Reparations might be paid directly to living victims long after events that, in our world, would already have passed mostly into historical debate. War itself might change for another reason. Training a skilled human becomes more valuable when that human can contribute for a century. A pilot, engineer, physician, or scientist represents decades of accumulated education that society is reluctant to lose. Militaries might invest even more heavily in remote systems and automation to avoid casualties. Public tolerance for war could decline because every young death destroys such an enormous expected future. But long-lived leaders might also plan conflicts on longer timescales. A strategic rivalry could last 70 years under many of the same decision-makers. Grudges and ambitions could become patient. A government might pursue territorial goals across half a century without the interruption of leadership turnover. Again, longevity offers no moral direction of its own. It magnifies continuity. Sometimes continuity protects civilization. Sometimes it preserves its worst habits. Religion and philosophy would inevitably respond. Many human traditions are shaped by awareness that life is brief. Poetry, ritual, inheritance, pilgrimage, and moral teaching often gain urgency from mortality. If a normal life lasted 160 years, the emotional distance to death would change, especially for the young. Would people feel less urgency to seek meaning? Perhaps at first. At 30, the end might seem impossibly far away. But humans adapt quickly to whatever lifespan feels normal. A 150-year-old may fear death just as strongly as an 80-year-old does in our world. Religious traditions would still confront impermanence. They would simply use different age metaphors. Ancient texts might speak of a life as 160 summers rather than 70 or 80. Coming-of-age ceremonies might occur later. Pilgrimages could be repeated at several life stages. Some traditions might prescribe periods of withdrawal and reflection every 40 years, recognizing that a long identity requires deliberate renewal. Philosophers would ask whether a life can become too long. Would boredom eventually hollow out desire? Would meaning depend on scarcity? This question appears simple until we look at ordinary human behavior. People rarely run out of possible experiences. The world contains more books than one person can read, more places than one person can visit, more skills than one person can master, more people than one person can know deeply. A century of extra healthy life would not exhaust reality, but it might exhaust a particular self. After 80 years in one profession, one city, one marriage, or one identity, a person may not need novelty because the world has become empty. They may need novelty because their old structure has become complete. Long-lived cultures would learn to treat reinvention as normal. Names might even change. Some societies could permit adults to adopt a formal second name when beginning a new major life chapter, not erasing the earlier identity, but marking transformation. A person might have one public name through early adulthood, another after a major career change, and retain both in legal records. Biographies would be organized in volumes. Obituaries could be absurdly long, and birthdays might lose some of their current meaning. Mara remembers her 50th birthday as a large celebration because 50 remained culturally important from older traditions. By her 100th, she does not feel ancient. Her friends joke that triple digits are merely proof that the calendar uses base 10. The major celebrations have shifted elsewhere. The completion of a first 40-year career, the beginning of a second education, the 100th anniversary of a friendship, the day someone pays off a 60-year home loan, the first time a person meets a great-grandchild, the last day of a long public service term. A civilization with abundant years might become less fascinated by the number itself and more interested in how the years are divided. Before we follow Mara farther, there is another biological consequence worth exploring because it would shape civilization from the beginning. Reproduction. If humans simply doubled lifespan while women still experienced menopause around 50 and most people still had children in their 20s, society would contain an enormous post-reproductive population and generations would overlap much more heavily than they do now. That is possible in principle. Humans already have unusually long post-reproductive lives compared with many mammals. But if this longer lifespan evolved gradually through natural selection, rather than arriving suddenly through medicine, the reproductive schedule would probably change too. Not necessarily by doubling every age. Evolution does not work with rulers. But later maturation, later average parenthood, and a longer reproductive window would all be plausible parts of a slower life history strategy. A person might become fully fertile only somewhat later than in our world, remain fertile longer, and have children at wider intervals. The result would be a population that reproduces more slowly. This matters because long generation times reshape evolution itself. A species whose generations are separated by 45 years experiences fewer generations in 10,000 years than a species whose generations are separated by 25. Genetic evolution proceeds more slowly in calendar time because natural selection has fewer generational turnovers through which to change allele frequencies. Cultural evolution, however, can still race ahead. And this alternate humanity would possess something extraordinary, very long-lived carriers of culture. Imagine the first farmers. In our timeline, agricultural communities learned through generations which seeds tolerated drought, which soils exhausted quickly, which irrigation systems failed after decades, and which storage methods protected grain. Much of that knowledge had to move from parent to child. In the long-lived timeline, an individual farmer might personally observe 80 harvests. She remembers the drought at 30, the flood at 52, the pest outbreak at 70, and the soil failure at 91. She can compare them not through inherited story, but through lived experience. This could make some forms of practical knowledge deeper and more conservative. A farming community might become extraordinarily skilled at local adaptation. But innovation could slow if elders who mastered old methods resist new ones. The same dual effect appears in early cities. A builder who constructed a wall at 40 could inspect it at 120. An administrator could remember tax reforms from 6 decades earlier. A merchant could maintain trade relationships across enormous spans of time. Legal precedent could be transmitted directly by people who participated in the original dispute. Writing would still matter enormously, because no human memory is perfect and no person lives forever. But the transition from oral memory to archives might feel different. A treaty signed 80 years earlier could still have surviving signatories. A historian writing about a revolution might interview participants who were adults when it began and are still active citizens. Chronicles would contain fewer phrases like "no one now remembers." The ancient world might therefore feel less ancient to itself. Think of an alternate Roman senator who at 110 remembers hearing, as a child, first-hand stories from soldiers who fought in wars a century earlier. Or an engineer in Alexandria who spends 70 years refining one family of machines. Or a physician who observes patterns of disease across 3 generations of the same households. Knowledge networks would gain continuity. Political institutions might gain inertia. A senate of long-lived elites could become almost immovable without strong rotation rules. Land ownership might remain concentrated in the same individuals for generations. Aristocracies could become harder to dislodge because their founders do not quickly become ancestors. They remain alive, managing property, alliances, and patronage themselves. Revolutions might therefore be rarer, or more explosive when they finally come. A young generation unable to gain property or authority because people 100 years older still occupy every position may eventually stop waiting politely. The phrase generation gap would describe something larger than taste in music. It could describe a struggle over whether the future is allowed to arrive. Some long-lived societies would solve this better than others. Cultures that formally transfer authority before death might remain flexible. Elders could retain respected advisory roles while surrendering offices and property to younger adults at fixed ages. Other societies might let power accumulate until resentment becomes dangerous. Over thousands of years, cultural traditions encouraging voluntary succession could become as important to stable civilization as constitutions are in ours. A ruler stepping down at 80 might be praised not because 80 is old, but because 40 years of leadership is considered enough. This would change monarchy in fascinating ways. A king could reign for a century, which sounds impressive until one imagines the succession crisis. An heir might be 90 before inheriting the throne. The heir's own children might already be 60. Courts would become crowded with adults who have spent most of a normal human lifetime waiting for one person to die. Some monarchies might therefore adopt abdication as routine. Others might divide reigns into fixed periods. A crown could pass to a younger relative while the former monarch remains alive as a ceremonial elder. The idea that authority must follow mortality would weaken. That could be one of the biggest conceptual shifts of all. In our world, death forces renewal even when institutions resist it. A long-lived world cannot rely on death to do that work. It must learn to create renewal deliberately. The same is true inside businesses, universities, families, religions, and artistic movements. And art would become remarkable. Imagine a composer whose first works are written at 30 and whose final works appear at 140. Critics would divide the career into periods spanning decades. A painter could move through 5 major styles. A novelist might publish 20 books before deciding at 90 to stop writing fiction and become a sculptor. Would creative achievement become deeper? Sometimes. But artistic culture depends on turnover too. Movements often arise partly because younger creators reject what older creators built. If the older creators remain active and famous for another 70 years, rebellion may become more intense. The avant-garde could spend an unusually long time arguing with its grandparents. Music scenes might contain performers separated by a century of age who are all still active. A singer who first became famous in 2060 might still release albums in 2150. The concept of a comeback would become absurdly flexible, and popular memory would be transformed. Celebrities would remain public figures for longer than many cultural institutions. Scandals could follow them for 90 years. Old interviews would circulate during entirely different technological eras. The internet would accumulate more personal history than any human being could reasonably escape. That would make digital forgetting essential. A long life requires the possibility of change, but permanent archives freeze earlier selves. Mara understands this when she is 97. 5 years into her medical career, she applies for a position at a new hospital. An automated background system retrieves a public argument she had online at 22, 75 years earlier. The language embarrasses her. She barely remembers writing it. The hospital does not reject her because law prevents employers from using minor conduct older than 30 years unless it has clear professional relevance. The rule exists because society learned, painfully, that nobody can live 160 years if every mistake remains socially present for the entire journey. Forgiveness becomes infrastructure, not merely virtue. Without it, longevity could become unbearable. This would influence relationships too. Imagine carrying every argument with a partner across 100 years. Healthy long-term relationships might depend on deliberate rituals of renewal. Couples could mark 25-year intervals by renegotiating expectations. Some take separate sabbaticals. Others recommit. Some decide peacefully that one shared chapter is complete. Mara married once at 36. Her partner, Tomas, was a civil engineer. They spent 43 years together. In our world, that would already count as a long marriage. In theirs, they separated while both were still considered middle-aged. There was no betrayal, no dramatic collapse. They had simply become different people. At 79, they decided that continuing out of habit would turn affection into resentment. They remained friends. Tomas attended Mara's medical graduation at 92. Years later, when he developed a serious illness, Mara visited him often, not as his physician, but as the person who remembered who he had been at 36. Long life would create many relationships like this. Former partners might remain part of a person's social world for another 70 years. Blended families could become extraordinarily complex. Children might have parents who separated half a century earlier, but still attend the same family gatherings. The vocabulary of family would expand, and so would the emotional skill required to maintain it. Perhaps long-lived cultures would become better at endings that are not deaths. Jobs end. Marriages end. Identities end. Cities are left behind. Friendships sometimes fade. A person cannot carry every commitment for 150 years. Learning to finish a chapter without treating it as failure might become one of the central skills of adulthood. This changes ambition. In our world, people often feel pressure to achieve early because time is limited and social comparisons are intense. Lists celebrate entrepreneurs under 30, professors under 40, artists who became famous young. In Mara's world, early achievement still impresses people, but it is less decisive. Someone who appears directionless at 50 may become a major scientist at 90. A writer may publish nothing until 75 and still have a 60-year career. A person can spend 30 years raising children, then return to education without feeling that professional life has passed them by. Biographies become less front-loaded. Late bloomers are no longer unusual. That could relieve enormous pressure. It could also create new pressure. If you have 120 adult years, what excuse do you have not to become excellent at something? Why have you not learned 3 languages? Why have you not changed careers if you are unhappy? Why have you not traveled? Why are you still uncertain at 70? More time can produce more compassion for wandering. It can also produce more expectations. Humans are talented at turning gifts into standards. So people would still compare themselves. They would simply have larger timelines on which to do it. Economists would notice another effect. Longer lives change the value of education. If a difficult qualification takes 10 years but can support 80 years of work, society can justify extremely deep training. Physicians might spend 15 years in formal preparation. Engineers could study broad foundational science before specializing. Craftspeople might apprentice for a decade because there is still a century in which to use the skill. This could produce extraordinary expertise. but it could also slow entry into independence. Young adults might remain financially dependent into their 30s. Established professionals might argue that nobody under 50 has enough experience for senior responsibility. Younger workers could become frustrated by cultures that always tell them to wait because everyone has time. Time abundance can become a tool of exclusion. "You are young. Wait another 20 years," would be an easy way for older generations to protect their positions. Movements for youth representation would emerge. Parliaments might reserve seats for citizens under 60. Corporate boards might be required to include multiple age cohorts. Universities could guarantee research funding to early career scholars even when early career lasts until 50. Age discrimination would become multidirectional. Older adults could be unfairly treated as rigid even when cognitively sharp. Younger adults could be dismissed as inexperienced for far too long. Society would spend centuries learning that chronological age tells only part of the story. And eventually, it would encounter one of the deepest surprises of longevity. People do not all age at the same rate. Even in our world, biological aging varies. Two people of the same chronological age can differ substantially in physical function, disease burden, cognition, and resilience. In a species with a normal lifespan of 160 years, those differences would have more time to accumulate. At 120, one person might be hiking mountains while another needs daily care. Insurance, employment, and law would struggle with the temptation to measure biological age directly. A blood test, imaging profile, or molecular clock might estimate how rapidly someone is aging. Employers could want that information. Insurers could price it. Governments could use it to decide eligibility for benefits. The technology would be useful medically. It could also become deeply invasive. Imagine being 70 and told by an algorithm that your body resembles the average 90-year-old. Does your employer have a right to know? Does your bank? Does someone deciding whether to marry you? Longevity would make privacy about aging a major civil rights issue. Mara, now a physician, spends much of her second career confronting exactly this problem. Her specialty is not curing aging. It is helping people navigate the uneven way it unfolds. In the clinic, age appears in layers. One morning, Mara meets a 106-year-old carpenter named Jalen, who has the cardiovascular fitness of someone decades younger, but severe arthritis in 2 fingers after 80 years of repetitive work. His body has aged slowly, but his occupation has had a century in which to leave marks. Another patient is 89 and biologically much older than expected after decades of exposure to industrial pollution. A third is 137 and astonishingly robust, largely independent, annoyed that her children keep calling to ask whether she has taken her medication. Mara learns that a long-lived species has not abolished aging. It has made the variation more visible. Preventive medicine, therefore, begins extraordinarily early and lasts extraordinarily long. Vaccination schedules extend across a century. Cancer screening continues for decades. Bone and muscle maintenance is treated as a lifelong project. Hearing protection matters because ears may need to serve for 150 years. Dental care becomes almost sacred. Losing teeth at 70 would be a major problem if another 90 years remain. Replacement technologies advance partly because the demand is so obvious. Artificial joints are designed to be revised several times across a lifespan. Heart valves must last longer or be easily replaced. Prosthetics become modular. Organ transplantation raises difficult questions because a 60-year-old recipient is not near the end of life. That person may be seeking an organ capable of serving for another century. Regenerative medicine becomes one of the largest scientific fields. Yet, even in this biologically slower aging species, the distinction between lifespan and health span remains central. Nobody wants 160 years if the final 40 are spent in severe decline. So success is measured not simply by average age at death, but by years of independence, mobility, cognition, and connection. This might make public health more ambitious than ours. A government cannot celebrate longer life if citizens spend half of it chronically ill. Cities invest heavily in walkability because mobility preserved at 90 matters economically. Workplaces reduce cumulative physical strain. Food regulation becomes stricter about substances whose harms appear only after decades. Noise, air pollution, ultraviolet exposure, and occupational chemicals are treated with unusual seriousness because small injuries can compound over a century. People become living records of policy quality. A neighborhood built beside a polluted industrial zone cannot simply wait for the affected generation to pass away. Those residents may remain politically active for another 80 years, carrying medical evidence and memory with them. Long lives make slow injustice harder to hide, but they can also make privilege extraordinarily persistent. Mara sees this in medicine constantly. Wealthy patients arrive at 120 with bodies carefully maintained by preventive care, safe jobs, nutritious food, exercise, and early treatment. Poorer patients arrive at the same age carrying decades of accumulated occupational wear and untreated disease. The difference between them is not only money, it is functional time. One person may receive 140 healthy years. Another may spend the last 40 of a nominally long life managing disability that could have been prevented. Public debate eventually develops a phrase for this, the longevity gap. Governments publish it alongside income inequality. How many healthy years separate the richest districts from the poorest? How many years are lost to pollution, violence, dangerous labor, untreated hypertension, preventable infection, or inadequate housing? A society that has evolved the capacity for long life becomes acutely aware that biology provides only the possibility. Civilization determines how much of it is delivered. Population structure changes in ways that are equally profound. In our world, societies often speak of population aging as an increase in the share of older people relative to working-age people. But age categories are built around present human biology. If healthy adulthood lasts to 130, a country with many 90-year-olds is not necessarily burdened by a huge dependent population. Those 90-year-olds may be surgeons, farmers, electricians, entrepreneurs, caregivers, and teachers. The population pyramid stretches upward, but the economic meaning of each age changes. A stable, long-lived population might contain enormous numbers of people between 60 and 120 who are still independent and intermittently employed. Birth rates would probably need to be low enough to compensate for low mortality and long survival. With later reproduction and fewer births per year, population growth could remain manageable, but transitions would be delicate. If mortality fell before fertility adjusted, cities could experience generations of crowding. If fertility later fell too far, the long delay between generations could make recovery slow. Demographers would think in centuries. A policy affecting births today might reshape population structure 100 years later, while many of the policymakers who introduced it are still alive. Migration would become equally important. A person could migrate at 40, build a life in a new country for 80 years, and still remember childhood elsewhere. Diasporas would contain people whose direct personal memories reach across more than a century of political change. Citizenship laws based on generation counts would become confusing when generations are so long. A family might live in one country for 120 years and still consist partly of the original migrants. The idea of first generation could last an astonishingly long time. Languages might change more slowly in some ways because older speakers remain numerous. At the same time, long-lived people would experience greater linguistic change within their own lives. Mara's mother, Elian, sometimes uses expressions that younger people consider archaic. She has watched slang appear, become embarrassing, return ironically, and become old-fashioned again. She remembers technologies nobody under 100 has used. Mara remembers Elian, in her late 140s, describing how people once carried separate physical devices for tasks now handled invisibly by their environment. Mara had laughed because she remembered them too. Mara's son does not. Long life makes technological change feel faster, not slower, because a single person witnesses more of it. Imagine being born before household computers and living to see technologies a century and a half later. In our world, some people already experience breathtaking change over 90 years. In this alternate world, that experience becomes normal. People would need to relearn basic interfaces repeatedly. Careers would be disrupted multiple times by automation. Entire industries could appear and disappear during one person's working life. This would make lifelong education not a pleasant cultural ideal, but an economic necessity. Nobody could expect skills learned at 30 to remain sufficient at 100. The phrase digital native would lose meaning after several technological revolutions. Everyone eventually becomes an immigrant to the future. And perhaps long-lived people would become better at that transition simply through practice. Mara has already watched architecture move through materials, software, automation, and climate standards that barely existed when she trained. Then she entered medicine and watched diagnostics transform again. As her second career continues, she no longer expects any system to remain familiar. She has learned a kind of intellectual humility that shorter lives sometimes make optional. The future will arrive whether she understands it or not. So she keeps learning. This attitude could accelerate innovation. Long-lived experts can carry deep knowledge across technological eras, connecting ideas that shorter careers might keep separate. An engineer who worked on early fusion experiments could still be present when commercial systems mature. A biologist who helped sequence primitive genomes could later work with technologies unimaginable at the start of her career. But entrenched expertise could still slow change. So the net effect on technological progress is uncertain. Would civilization advance faster because minds remain productive longer? Or slower because institutions turn over less often? Probably both, in different fields and periods. Some discoveries benefit from patience and cumulative mastery. Others require a generation willing to say that everyone senior is asking the wrong question. A long-lived civilization would need to manufacture intellectual youth culturally, even when biological youth is rarer. One place where extra lifespan would clearly change ambition is space exploration. A mission lasting 20 years is enormous in our world. It consumes a large fraction of an adult career and family life. For someone expecting 160 years, 20 years is still long, but it is less totalizing. A scientist could spend 15 years traveling to and working in a distant settlement, return home at 70, and begin another major career. Slow missions through the outer solar system become easier to imagine with human crews. A 30-year scientific expedition no longer means sacrificing nearly an entire working lifetime. Interstellar distances remain immense. Living twice as long does not make light travel twice as fast. But psychologically and logistically, journeys lasting many decades become less impossible. A 40-year-old could depart on a 50-year mission and return at 90, still healthy. That changes what humans are willing to attempt. Long-term projects on Earth would expand too. Cathedrals, ecological restorations, underground infrastructure, language preservation, species recovery, and century experiments could all be personally completed by some of the people who started them. There is something beautiful in that. Humans often begin work whose final results they will never see. We plant forests for descendants. We build institutions meant to outlast us. We send spacecraft toward destinations we may not survive to witness. In Mara's world, more people get to see the ending. But this changes the moral character of patience. Planting a forest you will personally walk through in 90 years is not exactly the same act as planting one only strangers will enjoy. The long-lived world may become better at long projects partly because self-interest reaches farther. That is still useful. Civilization has never required every good outcome to come from pure altruism. Then, when Mara is 108, the longest relationship of her life ends. Her mother dies. Elian is 155. For several years, she had become noticeably frilier. Her mind remained mostly clear, but her heart no longer tolerated stress well. Walking to the market became walking around the block, then to the garden, then only across the house. The decline was gentle but undeniable. Mara, now a physician with 16 years of practice, knew exactly what the numbers meant. That did not make them easier. When Elian dies, Mara experiences a grief that is both familiar and strange. She has had a mother for 108 years. There has never been a Mara without Elian somewhere in the world. The relationship contains more than a century of ordinary details: recipes, arguments, birthdays, messages, illnesses, jokes repeated too many times, periods of closeness, periods when they barely spoke, reconciliations, and long stretches when neither imagined the relationship could ever end. At the funeral, Mara's son is 69. He has lost a grandmother who was present for his entire life. Tomas, Mara's former partner, sits several rows behind them. Old friends arrive who knew Elian when all of them were young. Some are 140. The room contains people carrying overlapping memories that span more than a century. Mara suddenly understands something that no longevity statistic can express. When relationships last longer, grief does not necessarily become larger in proportion to the years, but absence can feel stranger. A presence woven through 100 years of routine leaves an enormous shape when it disappears. For months afterward, Mara catches herself preparing to call her mother. The habit is older than many nations, and yet, slowly, grief changes. Humans in this world have not evolved immunity to sorrow. They have evolved more time in which to carry it. Years after Elian's death, Mara notices that the oldest memories have begun changing texture. She can still picture her mother's face easily. She remembers the sound of her laugh. But certain scenes that once felt immediate now seem like stories she has told herself so many times that she cannot tell where memory ends and narration begins. This would be another unavoidable feature of very long life. The human brain did not evolve to store a perfect century-long film, even in our hypothetical world. Slower biological aging might preserve cognitive function, but memory would still be selective. A person cannot retain every breakfast, conversation, commute, argument, lesson, and ordinary afternoon from 150 years. Forgetting is not merely failure. It is part of how minds remain usable. Long-lived people would therefore become curators of themselves. They would choose which records to preserve, which messages to delete, which photographs deserve annotation, which memories should remain private, and which stories should be passed forward. Personal archives might contain a century of voice recordings. Artificial systems could help search them. A person might ask to hear the voice of herself at 30 or watch a conversation with a parent who died 40 years earlier. That would be comforting. It could also make letting go more difficult. Every technological solution to forgetting creates a new question about whether forgetting sometimes protects us. Would a person want perfect access to every heartbreak from 100 years ago, every humiliation, every angry message, every version of someone they once loved? Long life would force society to distinguish preservation from obsession. Mara keeps only part of her archive active. After her mother's death, she stores most of Elian's recordings in a family collection that requires a deliberate request to open. She does not want her mother constantly resurfacing through automated reminders. Memory, she decides, should be available without becoming unavoidable. That principle becomes common in long-lived cultures. The same idea shapes public history. Societies preserve more testimony because witnesses remain alive longer, but they also build rituals that allow political generations to move forward. Anniversaries matter. So do endings. A peace agreement may include a formal centennial ceremony at which the final obligations between former enemies are reviewed and, if appropriate, closed. 100 years is no longer beyond living memory. It is a human scale interval. This changes the meaning of a century. In our world, a century feels historical. Buildings 100 years old are old buildings. A business lasting 100 years is unusually durable. A person cannot personally span much more than 1 century. In Mara's world, a century becomes something a single adult can remember. A 100-year mortgage is still absurdly long, but not unimaginable. A scientific project lasting 80 years can have continuity of leadership. A friendship can celebrate its 100th anniversary. A person can return to a town after 90 years and remember the street before half its buildings existed. This would alter storytelling. Family sagas might need fewer generations to cover long periods. Historical novels set 80 years in the past could feature characters whose real-life contemporaries are still living. The distinction between personal memory and history moves outward, and people would become direct witnesses to the consequences of their younger selves. At 126, Mara is invited to a ceremony at the coastal city she helped redesign after the storm when she was 56. 70 years have passed. The flood barriers have been modified twice. Several neighborhoods, she argued should never have been rebuilt, have finally been converted to wetlands. A public square she designed is shaded by trees that were thin saplings when the project opened. Mara stands beneath them. The oldest trunks are wider than she can encircle with her arms. For a moment, she remembers signing the planting plans. She had been impatient then. The drawings showed mature canopies, but the actual square looked exposed and unfinished. A landscape architect told her, "Give it time." Now the sentence returns after 70 years. Give it time. In Mara's world, more people receive the extraordinary privilege of seeing what time does. They see whether a marriage survives its first certainty, whether a political promise holds, whether a forest returns, whether a building ages gracefully, whether a scientific theory survives new evidence, whether a child becomes the adult everyone predicted, whether they themselves become who they intended to be. That could make people humbler. Many youthful certainties would have enough time to be disproved personally. But even 160 years would not make humans all-knowing. There would always be processes longer than a life. Civilizations rise and fall over centuries. Evolution moves through generations. Geological change ignores personal timescales. Stars remain patient beyond comprehension. Doubling lifespan would move the boundary between human and historical time. It would not erase the boundary. And this matters because the fantasy of extreme longevity often contains a hidden hope that enough time might finally make life feel complete. Perhaps there would be time to learn everything important, to repair every relationship, to visit every place, to become every version of yourself. But a longer world would probably teach the opposite lesson. Possibility expands with time. At 80, Mara discovers medicine and realizes there are entire sciences she barely understands. At 110, she learns enough about biology to see how much more remains unknown. At 130, she meets students studying fields that did not exist when she was young. The horizon keeps moving. A longer life does not become a completed list. It becomes a larger landscape. That may be why boredom would not necessarily dominate this world. People become bored when circumstances stop offering meaningful variation, not simply because a clock has run too long. A healthy person with access to relationships, learning, creativity, movement, and purpose can encounter novelty at any age. The danger would be social stagnation, not biological duration itself. If institutions trapped people in one role for a century, life could feel unbearably repetitive. If society allowed reinvention, long life might feel spacious rather than endless. Mara's own life demonstrates this. Architecture filled her first major adult chapter. Medicine filled the second. After 134, she reduces her clinical work. Her hands remain steady, but she no longer enjoys the pace of the hospital. She begins teaching younger physicians 2 days a week. Around 135, another change becomes harder to ignore. For the first time, Mara feels that biological old age is no longer a distant country. Not suddenly. Recovery after exercise takes longer. A minor respiratory infection leaves her tired for several weeks. Her eyesight requires more correction. She begins forgetting names more often, although her reasoning remains sharp. Doctors start using the language of advanced age with her. She finds this strangely offensive. She has spent more than a century thinking of herself as someone with plenty of time. Now, at last, time begins to narrow. The transition feels almost more dramatic because it arrived so late. Then, almost accidentally, she becomes involved with a community garden built beside the medical school. She knows little about horticulture. This delights her. At 138, after more than a century of adulthood, Mara once again becomes a beginner. She kills several plants. She misidentifies a fungus. A 29-year-old gardener explains soil drainage to her with extraordinary patience. Mara listens. There is no humiliation in it. Perhaps this would be one of the most important cultural adaptations to long life, preserving the ability to be inexperienced. If age always implied mastery, anyone over 100 would be crushed by expectation. Long-lived people would need permission to start badly at new things. The elderly beginner might become a familiar and respected figure. That could soften age hierarchies. A 140-year-old expert in medicine may be a complete novice in music. A 50-year-old manager may learn mathematics from a 90-year-old student who started late. Expertise becomes more local to a field and less easily confused with general superiority. No one has enough time to master everything, even with twice as much of it. Then we should ask one more scientific question before this imagined life reaches its final chapter. Could humans actually evolve this way from where we are now? Not on any timescale relevant to an individual person. Natural evolution of a complex trait, such as dramatically slower aging, would require many generations of heritable variation and selection. And because human generations are already long, evolutionary change of this scale would take enormous stretches of time. Modern medicine also changes survival in ways that are not equivalent to natural selection for slower senescence. Current longevity research is therefore a different question from tonight's hypothetical. Scientists are learning much more about the biology of aging. Modern frameworks describe interconnected processes including genomic instability, telomere attrition, epigenetic changes, loss of protein homeostasis, impaired autophagy, altered nutrient sensing, mitochondrial dysfunction, cellular senescence, stem cell exhaustion, altered communication between cells, chronic inflammation, and changes in the microbiome. Researchers can manipulate some aging-related pathways in laboratory animals. Certain interventions extend lifespan or health span in particular species or experimental conditions. But a mouse living longer after an intervention does not mean humans are close to routinely living 160 years. Human aging is slower, more complex, and expensive to study because meaningful outcomes may require decades. Treatments must be safe enough for people who are not currently ill. Changes that improve one biological system can create problems in another. Stimulating cell growth may improve regeneration while increasing cancer risk. Suppressing growth may reduce cancer while impairing repair. The body is a network of trade-offs. That is why an evolved, long-lived human is easier to imagine as a whole biological package than as a person who simply takes one miraculous pill. Evolution would have had immense time to adjust interacting systems together. Our medicine does not have that luxury. There is another misconception worth gently setting aside. Human lifespan has already increased greatly in historical statistics, but much of that improvement came from preventing early death. Cleaner water, sanitation, vaccination, nutrition, safer childbirth, antibiotics, and treatment of disease. Historical averages were pulled downward heavily by infant and child mortality. Increasing average life expectancy is not the same as doubling the intrinsic pace of human aging. Our hypothetical is far more radical. A 120-year-old would not merely be an unusually successful survivor of ordinary aging. Her biology would be aging differently, which returns us to evolution. Modern evolutionary genetics continues to support the broad principle that natural selection weakens with age. Harmful effects appearing late can persist because fewer individuals historically survived long enough for those effects to strongly influence reproduction. Genes that help early in life can be favored even if they cause costs later. For humans to evolve much slower senescence, the selective value of later life would have to remain important. Perhaps late reproduction extends farther. Perhaps older adults' knowledge and care dramatically increase descendant survival. Perhaps safer cooperative societies allow enough individuals to reach later ages that selection can act more strongly there. Probably several pressures work together. The exact path is speculative. The consequences, however, tell us something real about how deeply lifespan is connected to society. Change one biological number, and almost everything else must move around it. Education, marriage, inheritance, political succession, professional authority, population structure, criminal punishment, environmental planning, historical memory. Even the age at which someone feels embarrassed to admit they do not know what they want to do with their life. Then one afternoon, Mara turns 150. Her family gathers in the garden beside her home. There is no enormous public celebration. 150 is old, certainly, but not mythical. Several people in the neighborhood are older. Her son, now 111, arrives first carrying food. His daughter is 59. Her daughter, Mara's great-granddaughter, is 14 and complains that everyone keeps telling the same family stories. Mara finds this reassuring. Some things have survived the evolutionary transformation unchanged. Tomas died several years earlier, at 148. They had remained friends until the end. Mara keeps a photograph of them from their wedding, both looking impossibly young and absolutely convinced that they understood themselves. Her medical students have sent messages. Former architecture colleagues have sent more. A gardener from the community plot gives her a plant she is told is difficult to kill. Mara says she appreciates the lack of confidence. Late in the afternoon, her great-granddaughter sits beside her. The girl has been studying history and has a question. Was life different when you were young? Mara laughs. Of course. No, the girl says. I mean, did it feel longer? Mara looks at her. The question is stranger than it first appears. Did 150 years feel like 150 years? Did the decades accumulate into something vast? Mara thinks about childhood rooms that now feel like dreams. She thinks about architecture, Tomas, the storm, medical school at 82, her mother's voice, patients whose names she remembers, patients whose names she has forgotten, the coastal trees, the garden, and the many ordinary years between dramatic events. She thinks about how enormous 10 years seemed when she was 10, how quickly 10 years seemed to pass after 100. Finally, she says, it felt like a life. The girl frowns. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. And perhaps it is the answer our hypothetical has been moving toward all along. If humans evolved to live twice as long, those lives would not feel like our current lives with an extra lifetime attached to the end. They would feel normal from the inside. Children would still think adulthood was far away. Young adults would still postpone things. Middle-aged people would still wonder how time moved so quickly. Older people would still be surprised by the narrowing future. Birthdays would move, expectations would move, careers would move, but the mind would adapt to the scale it was given. A 160-year life would not feel infinite. It would simply define what finite means. That evening, after everyone leaves, Mara walks slowly through her garden. At 150, she is old now. Truly old. Her steps are careful. She uses a light cane on uneven ground. The long biological protections that carried her through more than a century of strong adulthood have not defeated time. They only delayed its effects. She is tired more easily. She also knows what tiredness means now and does not resent it as much as she once imagined she would. Near the far wall stands a young tree planted by her great-granddaughter that morning. Mara touches one of its leaves. She is unlikely to see the tree at the age of the coastal trees she visited decades earlier. This thought does not feel tragic. For almost her entire life, Mara belonged to a species accustomed to seeing long projects finish. Now she has finally begun something she knows another person will have to continue. The experience is strangely peaceful, because even in a world where humans live twice as long, there will always be trees whose shade belongs to someone else. There will always be questions a scientist begins but cannot answer. Buildings whose final use an architect cannot predict. Children whose entire lives no parent can witness. Stories whose endings arrive after the storyteller. Longevity can move the boundary. It cannot remove it. And perhaps that boundary is part of what keeps one life connected to other lives. If no one could finish everything alone, knowledge must still be handed forward. Care must still cross generations. Someone must still plant without seeing the mature tree. Someone must still trust people who come later. Mara turns back toward the house. The evening is warm. Somewhere beyond the garden, a train moves quietly through the city. Windows brighten one by one as daylight fades. Inside homes around her, people at every stage of these long lives are doing ordinary things. A 30-year-old is worrying about an exam. A 60-year-old is wondering whether to leave a career. A 90-year-old is falling in love. A 120-year-old is arguing with a sibling. A child is certain that next summer will take forever to arrive. The calendar has stretched. Human nature has not become unrecognizable. And now, gently, our imagined century and a half can begin to quiet. We started with an 82-year-old opening a birthday present and preparing for medical school, in a world where 82 was not an ending but a doorway. We followed that longer life far enough to see that extra years would change almost everything around them, while leaving something deeply familiar at the center. There would be more time to learn, to love, to recover from mistakes, to change direction, and to watch slow work finally mature. There would also be more time for power to harden, wealth to accumulate, old grievances to linger, and inequality to decide who actually receives the healthy years biology made possible. And beneath all of it would remain the same basic truth. No immortality. No single switch that defeats age. Only a human animal whose maintenance systems hold together for longer, and a society forced to decide what to do with the additional time. Twice the lifespan would not automatically produce twice the wisdom. It would simply give wisdom more time in which to be learned, and perhaps more time in which to be forgotten, relearned, and handed forward. Now let the numbers themselves soften. 160 years, 120, 82. They can drift away like dates written lightly on a page. You do not need to solve the evolution of aging tonight. You do not need to decide how long a perfect human life should last, or how governments would organize pensions in a world where 90 is middle age. Whatever biology allows, every life is experienced one evening at a time. One conversation, one meal, one ordinary morning that does not announce how important it may someday become in memory. Perhaps that is why doubling life would not double our ability to feel time. A century can only be lived moment by moment, the same way an hour is. So let this hour become smaller now. Let Mara's long city recede into the distance. Let the medical school grow quiet. Let the garden settle beneath the evening sky. Let that young tree stand by the wall, needing nothing from us tonight except time. Your breathing can become slower. Your shoulders can become heavier against whatever is supporting you. There is no need to make good use of the next 100 years right now. There is no need even to make good use of the next hour. Rest is also something a life is made of, even a very long one. And if humans someday discover ways to remain healthy for far longer than we do now, perhaps people in that distant world will still end their days exactly as people always have, setting aside unfinished plans, leaving questions for morning, closing their eyes while the world continues without their attention for a little while. For tonight, that is enough. Let the future be long or short on its own terms. Let the questions wait. Let the imagined birthdays, the century careers, the old friendships, the distant forests, and all those extra decades drift beyond the edge of thought. There will always be more time to wonder when morning comes. But right now, there is only this quiet part of the day, the room around you, the weight of rest, the simple fact that you do not need to go anywhere else. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time for another quiet journey into another enormous question. Good night.